ever since the end of World War II, Brazil's been on this really fascinating, decades-long journey to find and project its own unique voice on the world stage. It's a story of ambition, of tension, and a relentless quest for development. So how did Brazil navigate this complex dance? Let's trace the steps of its diplomatic journey. This right here is the core question that has shaped Brazilian foreign policy for over 70 years. Is it better to align with a global superpower for security and influence, or do you carve out an independent path to protect your own national interests? Brazil's story is a constant dance between these two poles.
So, to really unpack this, we're going to start with the core ideology that's been the engine behind everything. From there, we'll journey through the major political eras, from the post-war republic and the military regime to the modern new republic. And then finally, we'll tie it all together to see the legacy that shapes Brazilian diplomacy today.
Before we dive into specific governments, we need to understand the philosophical engine that's powered almost every single one of Brazil's foreign policy decisions. It's a concept that puts the nation's own internal growth above all else. This idea, national developmentalism, really took hold under Getúlio Vargas back in the 1930s. It frames foreign policy not as an end in itself, but as a tool, a crucial instrument for achieving domestic goals. Think industrialization, economic sovereignty, and national progress. Keep that lens in mind because it explains so many of the choices we're about to see. So, with the world split into two camps after World War II, Brazil found itself at a crossroads. This first era, the Liberal Republic, was defined by a dramatic pendulum swing between two completely different answers to that core question of alignment versus autonomy. And this slide really highlights that stark contrast. On one side, you have President Dutra's policy of automatic alignment right after the war. Brazil joined U.S.-led security pacts like the Rio Treaty and placed itself firmly inside Washington's sphere of influence to contain communism. But just a decade later, the pendulum swings completely to the independent foreign policy, or PEI, which sought autonomy, new partners, and put Brazil's national interest firmly in the driver's seat. And this PEI was a huge turning point. It wasn't about isolation, it was about engagement on Brazil's own terms. The core idea, championed by thinkers like Foreign Minister Santiago Dantas, was that for Brazil to truly develop, it needed to reduce its external dependence. That required a creative, assertive diplomacy that could navigate the Cold War without being tied to the dictates of either superpower. This desire for autonomy didn't just appear overnight with the PEI. We saw sparks of it throughout the period. Vargas returned to power in the 50s on a wave of nationalism, creating the state oil giant Petrobras. President Kubitschek launched the Pan American Operation, arguing that the best way to fight communism in Latin America wasn't with weapons, but with development. Each step was a move away from simple alignment and toward a more self-directed foreign policy. Now, with the military coup of 1964, you might expect a complete return to that hardline pro-U.S. alignment. And, well, initially, that's what happened. But what's fascinating about the 21-year military regime is that its foreign policy wasn't monolithic. It evolved, it adapted, and eventually it embraced a surprisingly independent and pragmatic stance. And you can see that evolution clearly on this slide. Compare the early days of the regime under Castelo Branco, who championed ideological frontiers, breaking ties with Cuba and leading a U.S.-aligned intervention in the Dominican Republic, with the policy a decade later under General Geisel. His responsible pragmatism was a complete shift. He sought autonomy, diversified partners by opening ties with Communist China and striking a nuclear deal with West Germany, and focused intensely on Brazil's energy and development needs. And this brilliantly illustrates an early sign of that independent streak. This powerful phrase was Brazil's official critique of the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The military government argued that the treaty wasn't about disarmament, but about locking in the existing global power structure, freezing it in place, by allowing some nations to have nuclear weapons while denying them to all others. It was a bold stance against the superpowers. Geisel's pragmatic turn wasn't just talk, it was action. In 1974, Brazil recognized the People's Republic of China, a massive move during the Cold War. In 1975, it signed a comprehensive nuclear deal with West Germany for energy independence, a deal the U.S. strongly opposed. In that same year, it became one of the first countries to recognize the newly independent and socialist-led government in Angola, opening doors across Africa. So, the bottom line is that responsible pragmatism was a direct descendant of that national developmentalism we talked about. It put practical results for Brazil's interest above rigid ideology.
If dealing with China or socialist African nations would fuel Brazil's economic miracle, then ideology wasn't going to stand in the way. It was a calculated, assertive pursuit of autonomy. With Brazil's return to democracy in 1985, these principles of autonomy and development-focused diplomacy didn't disappear. Instead, they became institutionalized as Brazil began to build its role as a regional leader and a more assertive voice in global conversations.
A perfect example of this is the creation of Mercosur. This wasn't a sudden event. It began with a historic meeting in 1985 between the new democratic presidents of Brazil and Argentina, overcoming decades of rivalry. That led to concrete integration programs, which finally culminated in the founding of the Mercosur Common Market in 1991, cementing Brazil's role as a South American anchor.
In the 21st century, that assertive voice became even clearer. Brazil actively challenges agricultural protectionism at the World Trade Organization. It's one of the strongest voices calling for the reform of the UN Security Council, arguing its current structure is outdated. And it has championed South-South cooperation, forming groups like BRICS and IBAS with other major developing nations, a direct echo of the goals of the independent foreign policy from the 60s.
So, after this journey through different governments and ideologies, what are the big takeaways? Well, we can actually pull out a few consistent threads that weave through this entire 75-year story of Brazilian diplomacy. First, there's that constant tension, the pendulum swing between alignment and autonomy. Second, the main driver is almost always national development. Foreign policy is the tool, not the goal. And third, a principle of universalism, a tendency, especially in its more autonomous phases, to build relationships with any country, regardless of ideology, if it serves Brazil's national interest. These three threads provide a powerful framework for understanding Brazil's past, present, and future on the world stage. And that brings us to today. In a world of new great power rivalries, climate change, and economic transformation, Brazil once again finds itself navigating that classic tension between alignment and autonomy. The historical threads are all there, but how they'll be woven into the next chapter of Brazil's global story is still being written.